A Prickly Predicament. The Fossick Lane Mysteries, Book 1, by Win Valentine. Copyright 2026 by Win Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without written permission from the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. Formatted with vellum. 1. Arrival. The fog rolled in at 6:17 p.m., same as it did every evening in Crabapple Bend, Oregon. I knew this because the woman at the coffee shop, B, she'd said her name was, had mentioned it while pouring my fourth cup, and I'd checked my phone 3 times in the last minute to verify she wasn't pulling my leg. She wasn't. At 6:17 exactly, the fog rose from the cove like something with intention, creeping over the street lamps and the storefront windows with a precision that made my accountant's brain itch. It moved around a particular building. A narrow, old Victorian painted a shade of blue that didn't exist in nature, as if the structure had its own Do Not Disturb sign. Gets weirder when the moon's full, B had said, returning the pot to its station behind the counter. Her face suggested she found this phenomenon neither remarkable nor bothersome. Last month, it made a perfect spiral around the gazebo for 20 minutes, then just stopped. I'd nodded and said nothing, which was my default setting when confronted with information I couldn't fit into any logical framework. 48 years of forensic accounting had trained me to trust spreadsheets and paper trails, not atmospheric anomalies. Petrichor Coffee sat on the corner of what the locals called Crabapple Square. The actual crabapple tree dominated the center of the plaza, and it was enormous. Not in a natural way. The trunk was wide as a car, and the branches twisted overhead in patterns that seemed intentional, almost architectural. And it was blooming, in October, with flowers that looked silver under the streetlights. "You're the niece," B had said, not phrased as a question. "I'm Theodora Vane. I never go by it, but yes. Teddy. Gretchen was my great-aunt." Gretchen was wonderful. B refilled my cup without asking if I wanted more. Ran the Fossick for 30 years. Everyone in town knew her. You're going to have to navigate some expectations. The Fossick Lane Mysteries sounded like a shop dedicated to Agatha Christie adaptations. The actual storefront was subtler, a narrow building wedged between a hardware store and an antique collectibles shop, with windows that displayed what appeared to be high-end antiques. The sign above the door was painted in faded gold lettering, "The Fossick. Curiosities and Uncommon Goods." "What kind of expectations?" I asked. "The good kind, mostly. Gretchen was beloved. She gave away more tea and advice than she sold merchandise. Made a lot of people feel like they mattered." B paused. "Some people are going to be disappointed that you're not her." "I'm not her," I agreed. "I'm a forensic accountant going through a divorce, who apparently just inherited a magic shop from a great-aunt I met exactly once, at a family reunion when I was 6. B smiled, the kind that suggested she'd heard stranger openings. The magic shop part is the literal part, by the way, not metaphorical. Gretchen kept books on practical herbalism, did tarot readings for people, had a genuine interest in the occult. Some of the items she stocked were unusual. I'd spent the first hour after arriving at the Fossick going through the inventory. The items ranged from standard antique fare, porcelain figurines, leather-bound books, Victorian jewelry, to things that didn't have price tags. A rough crystal the size of my fist that felt cold even when I wasn't touching it. A leather journal bound with wire that made my fingers itch when I picked it up. A pocket watch with filigree work so intricate it should have required tools too small for human hands. The walk to the Fossick took me past storefronts that looked like they belonged in a town that cared about maintaining historical charm. a bookstore with hand-painted signs, a restaurant called the Salt Box that seemed to be closed for renovation, a narrow gallery featuring local artists. I'd left my car at a bed and breakfast on the edge of town. The drive from Portland had taken 3 hours, and I'd spent most of it contemplating the decision that had led me to inherit a magic shop in a small coastal town and start my life over at 48. The Fossick's door had a bell that chimed when I pushed it open. The interior smelled like old paper, lavender, and something else I couldn't identify. Something that made the back of my neck prickle in a way that suggested my nervous system was registering something my brain couldn't quite name. The shop was organized in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. The front room held antiques that would work in any collection: silverware, porcelain, furniture that was genuinely old enough to matter. The back room, visible through an archway, held the unusual items. Behind the counter was a letter, addressed to me in handwriting that was both elegant and precise. Gretchen's handwriting, I assumed, since the envelope contained a key and a series of documents that made me the legal owner of the Fossick and the apartment above it. "Welcome to Crabapple Bend," the letter began. "I suspect you're going to have a lot of questions. There are some answers in the ledger under the counter, and more answers available if you know how to ask the right people. For now, know this. You inherited the Fossick because you have the ability to inherit it. What you do with that ability is your choice. But this town needs someone who can see what others miss. I'm betting that's you. Gretchen." I read the letter 3 times and put it in my pocket. The apartment above the shop was small but clean, with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that opened onto the shop floor through a door that I immediately locked. The furniture was simple and worn in a way that suggested comfort rather than neglect. There were bookshelves everywhere, filled with volumes that ranged from paperback mysteries to leather-bound grimoires. By the time I'd unpacked my essentials and returned downstairs, Petrichor coffee was calling to me like a siren. I needed to understand this town better. I needed to figure out what Gretchen had meant about having the ability. And I needed to do it with enough caffeine that my brain could function. B had the kind of smile that suggested she'd expected me to show up for the 4th cup at some point. "How's the shop looking?" "Overwhelming," I admitted. "Did Gretchen really practice divination?" "She did tarot readings for people, mostly as a service. She was good at it, too. People would come back months later and tell her about things she'd predicted." B paused. Whether that was because she was genuinely sensitive or because she was good at reading people was a question everyone debated constantly. Which was it? Both? Neither? Magic in Crabapple Bend doesn't work the way it works in other places. B refilled my cup. The town sits on a ley line. There are protective spells dating back 200 years. Some people's abilities are stronger here than they'd be anywhere else. Gretchen's was one of those abilities. I should have had skeptical thoughts. 48 years of forensic accounting trained me towards skepticism. But there was something in the way the fog moved around the blue building. Something in the way B spoke about magic as casually as she spoke about the weather that made skepticism feel less like intellectual honesty and more like willful denial. "And you?" I asked. "Sugar glider," B said. "My familiar's in the back office. Her name is Confetti. She lets me feel things emotionally. Other people's emotions usually. Makes me a better barista because I can tell when someone needs to talk and when they just need their coffee and quiet." I'd spent 3 hours in a coffee shop in a magical town and hadn't recognized any of this as anything other than normal. B seemed to read something on my face because she smiled. "Give it a week. By then, you'll either be convinced you've had a breakdown, or you'll accept that magic is just another thing that happens in Crabapple Bend. Most people go with option 2. The walk back to the Fossick that evening took me past the blue building. Up close, I could see that it wasn't entirely blue. There were subtle layers of color underneath, suggesting that someone had painted over the original surface a dozen times and only partially covered what came before. And the way the fog moved around it was precise. Not around the building, I realized. Around a circle drawn on the street around the building, marked with symbols that I almost recognized. A protective spell, written into the geography of the town itself. I stood in the fog and tried very hard not to have a breakdown about how much of my understanding of the world might be wrong. 2. Quill. The apartment above the Fossick had a basement. I discovered this by accident while looking for the electrical panel, opening a door I'd assumed was a closet and finding stairs that descended into darkness. There was a light switch, which worked, which revealed a basement that was surprisingly clean for something that hadn't been mentioned in any of the paperwork. The space was organized into sections. One for storage, one for what appeared to be a small apothecary setup with jars of dried herbs and oils, and one section that was empty except for a large terrarium. Inside the terrarium was a hedgehog, not just any hedgehog, an African pygmy hedgehog, no more than 6 inches long with quills that seemed darker than hedgehogs should be, and eyes that tracked my movement with a level of intelligence that made my skin prickle. There was a note taped to the glass. His name is Quill. He was Gretchen's familiar. He'll help you settle in. He eats mealworms, fresh fruit, and has strong opinions about everything. Feed him before bed. Gee. You can't have strong opinions about everything, I said to the hedgehog. That's not how opinions work. The hedgehog curled into a ball and made a sound that suggested I was wrong on multiple counts. There was a bag of mealworms in the shelf above the terrarium. I opened a small container, dumped in a handful, and watched as the hedgehog uncurled and began eating with the focused intensity of something that took its meals seriously. I'm Teddy, I said. I suppose we're going to be living together? The hedgehog paused in its eating to look at me with what I can only describe as judgment. I spent the evening reading Gretchen's ledger, which turned out to be a combination journal, inventory list, and field guide to magical practitioners in Crabapple Bend. The entries ranged from detailed descriptions of antique items, including notes about their age, origin, and quality, to sketches of people I'd presumably meet, with descriptions like water magic, harbor official, blue heron familiar, and coffee shop owner, empath, manages town emotional dynamics. There was an entry for me, in Gretchen's handwriting. Theodora, psychometrist potential. Forensic accountant background suggests pattern recognition and emotional precision. She'll resist the magic at first, but she'll come to understand it. The town will need her. Psychometrist. The word was familiar from psychology class, but the context was different. Something about touching objects and sensing their history. I tried it before I could overthink the experience. I went upstairs and picked up the pocket watch from the front display, the one with the intricate filigree work that had unsettled me earlier. The world folded inward. I was holding something, and I was holding something that had been held by hands before my hands, and those hands belonged to someone I couldn't quite see. A man, maybe. Someone who'd wound this watch every evening and checked it obsessively, as if time was the only thing he could control. The image faded, and I was standing in the shop, gasping like I'd run miles, my heart racing in a way that suggested something had startled me at a biological level. I set the watch down with shaking fingers and went to the basement. I think I'm having a breakdown, I told Quill. I just touched a watch and saw something. A man, maybe. Time obsession. Am I hallucinating? Quill finished his mealworms and curled up in his terrarium, which I took as acknowledgement that the question was beyond his scope of expertise. I spent the rest of the night reading more of Gretchen's notes, learning about psychometry through the lens of someone who'd apparently practiced it. The ability to touch an object and sense emotional imprints from its previous owners. The stronger the emotion associated with the object, the clearer the impression. Objects with violent histories or intense emotional attachments could deliver more vivid information. The pocket watch had belonged to someone anxious, someone obsessed with precision and control, someone who'd been afraid of losing time. I tried it again with a teacup from the display, something ceramic with hand-painted flowers that looked Victorian. The impression was gentler. A woman, making tea, thinking about her daughter, feeling love and worry mixed together in the kind of complicated way that comes from parenting people you can't protect. By midnight, I'd touched 15 objects in the shop and received 15 impressions. Some were vivid, some were subtle. All of them felt like I was accessing information that shouldn't be available to me. I went back to the basement. I think I actually can do this, I told Quill. I think Gretchen was right. And I have a psychometric ability, and I'm a forensic accountant who just inherited a magic shop and discovered that magic is real. Quill made a small sound that suggested this was obvious and had been obvious since I'd arrived. You couldn't have given me a warning? He curled back up, apparently considering the conversation concluded. I climbed the stairs back to the apartment and made chamomile tea from the supply Gretchen had left. The tea tasted like comfort and subtle magic, something in the blend that made my nervous system calm the way medicine was supposed to but rarely did. By the time I'd finished drinking, I was able to accept the absurdity of my situation without descending into panic. I was a psychometrist. I ran a magic shop. I lived above a space that held more mysteries than I'd unpacked in the first 48 hours of arrival. I could either spend time resisting these facts or spend time learning to work with them. I went to bed with the apartment door open. I wanted to be able to hear if Quill needed anything, and fell asleep thinking about the weight of objects and the way emotions could leave impressions that lasted decades. The next morning, I went downstairs and found a customer waiting by the door, an older man with silver hair and eyes that were kind in a way that suggested he'd had to learn kindness deliberately. I heard Gretchen's niece had come to take over the faucet, he said when I let him in. I'm Desmond Crisp. I'm the town historian, and I have some questions about an inventory Gretchen kept. I made coffee and we spent the morning discussing antiques and the history of Crabapple Bend. Desmond was someone who paid attention to detail, the kind of person who noticed when patterns shifted. He told me about the town's founding families, about the protective spell that had been maintained for 200 years, about the ley line that ran beneath the town and made magic possible. Your great-aunt understood all of this, he said, his shoulders straightening with the weight of history. She was part of the magical infrastructure of the town, even if she never used her abilities for anything flashy. Do you understand what that means? I'm beginning to understand that inheriting a shop also means inheriting a responsibility, I said. He smiled. That's a start. After Desmond left, I went to the basement and sat by Quill's terrarium. I think I'm supposed to be helping, I said, and I think I have no idea how to do that. Quill made a small, encouraging sound, which was probably as close to affirmation as I was going to get from a hedgehog who'd just met me 24 hours ago. I fed him another handful of mealworms and went back upstairs to start cataloging the shop's inventory with new understanding. These weren't just antiques. They were objects with histories. They were tools that a psychometrist could use to understand people, solve mysteries, help people understand themselves. By evening, when Bee stopped by with pastries for dinner, I'd started to feel like the shop might actually be somewhere I could belong. How's Quill treating you? She asked. Like he expected me to show up eventually, I said. Like he's been waiting for someone with the ability to understand him. That's basically what he's been doing, Bee agreed. Gretchen's been gone for 6 months. Quill's been in the basement, eating mealworms and judging everyone who didn't know how to talk to him. I'm glad you're here. He's been very lonely. I looked at the hedgehog through the basement door window, curled up in his terrarium, making small, satisfied sounds as he ate fruit I'd left for him. I think we're going to do all right, I said to B. Me and the hedgehog. We're both starting over. Might as well do it together. San. The body. Vernon Crabbe died on a Tuesday, between 6 and 8 in the evening, according to Sheriff Louisa Restrepo, who arrived at the Fossick at 9 p.m. with her hand resting on the radio at her belt and her jaw set with focused attention. I need to ask you some questions about your neighbor, she said. You live upstairs from a closed antique shop, correct? Vernon Crabbe's shop? I nodded, my stomach already tight with the kind of awareness that comes from knowing someone in close proximity had stopped existing. I haven't been in yet. I've been unpacking. Someone walking past discovered the body around 8:30. Neighbors reported seeing the shop dark earlier in the evening. We're treating it as a natural death, but we're doing due diligence. She pulled out a notebook. Did you see or hear anything unusual last night? I hadn't. I'd been in the apartment, eating dinner, going through Gretchen's ledger, slowly coming to terms with the fact that magic was real. I'd been completely absorbed in my own processing to notice anything happening 15 feet away. The fog came in around 6:17, I said, because the detail seemed relevant somehow. I noticed the building it moved around, the blue one. Restrepo wrote something down. Anything else? No, I'm sorry. I'm still very new to town. She looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, and I had the distinct impression that she could see my entire life reflected in my face. The divorce, the job loss, the decision to upend everything and come to a town I'd never visited for a shop I'd never expected to inherit. Welcome to Crabapple Bend, she said finally. I'm sorry your first week is turning out this way. After she left, I sat in the apartment and tried to process the information. Vernon Crabbe had died. I'd been living next to a dead body without knowing it. The shop that had belonged to him would probably be closed for a while, giving me the chance to breathe and adjust to my new situation without constant reminders of all the ways I didn't belong here yet. Except that's when I decided to go downstairs and look through the shop window. The streetlight outside illuminated the interior enough to see the basic layout. The front room had fallen into chaos. Shelves overturned, merchandise scattered, items broken and displaced in a way that suggested violence or panic. And there, near the back of the shop, was something dark on the floor that I didn't want to think about too much. I called Restrepo back to report what I'd seen. Thank you for notifying me, she said crisply. Please don't approach the scene. We'll get a team out there in the morning for a proper investigation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs instead, made tea, and sat in the Fossick while the fog pressed against the windows. The fog had rolled in like routine, had moved around the blue building with its precise, intentional pattern, and had settled over the town like a blanket that somehow managed to both obscure and clarify things. Quill had come upstairs, his small claws clicking against the wooden floor. He'd settled onto the counter and stared at the wall that separated the Fossick from Vernon's shop. His quills had remained normal, not extended in agitation, not relaxed, but held in a state that suggested focused attention. Did you know him? I asked. Vernon Crabbe? Quill made a small sound that might have been a yes or might have been acknowledgement that the question was reasonable. Gretchen knew him, didn't she? I was working through this out loud, my forensic accountant brain trying to organize facts into a coherent narrative. He was a collector. He ran a shop. They probably knew each other professionally. Quill's attention shifted from the wall to me, and his eyes held something that felt like confirmation. If he died of natural causes, why was the shop so damaged? I continued. Was he attacked? Did he fall? Did something break his heart so thoroughly that his actual heart gave out? The last thought was weird and poetic and probably not useful, but it had lodged itself in my brain. I went back upstairs and pulled out Gretchen's ledger, searching for any mention of Vernon Crabbe. There was an entry, dated 3 years ago, VC has binding artifacts, refuses to discuss acquisitions or sell to interested parties, may need to approach differently if preservation of pieces becomes necessary. Binding artifacts. The phrase meant nothing to me, but the way Gretchen had written it suggested significance. I spent the rest of the night reading everything Gretchen had written about binding artifacts, protective spells, and the infrastructure of magic in Crabapple Bend. By morning, I had a fragmentary understanding. The town's protective spell, the binding, was ancient and powerful, but it required specific artifacts distributed around town to maintain it. These artifacts were guarded with meticulous attention, acquired deliberately, and kept out of circulation. And apparently, Vernon Crabbe had owned some of them. The next day, when I was allowed to approach my own shop after the investigation team had finished their preliminary sweep, I made a decision. I was going to touch the items in Vernon's shop, not because it was smart, and not because it was legal, but because I had an ability that might actually help answer the question of what had happened to him. I waited until evening, when Restrepo had returned to the sheriff's office. I used the key I'd found in Gretchen's papers to unlock the connecting door between the two shops, and I walked into chaos. The shelves were indeed overturned. Merchandise was scattered and broken. And near the back, there was the dark stain on the floor that I'd seen from the window. Now undeniably the outline of where a body had lain. I touched a vase that had been broken, then thrown aside. The impression was immediate and overwhelming. Rage, yes, but not directed at the vase. Older rage, layered on top of current violence. This object had been used, held in hands that were furious for a reason the object itself couldn't quite explain. I moved through the shop, touching things methodically, building a picture from emotional impressions rather than physical evidence. Someone had come here looking for something. They'd been frustrated, angry, desperate. And in that desperation, they'd broken things. But the most intense impression came from a pocket watch, partially buried under fallen debris near where Vernon's body had been found. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, I gasped. The rage that hit me was so directed, so purposeful, that I felt physically struck by it. Someone had held this watch. Someone had filled it with intention and emotion so powerful that 3 days later the object still vibrated with resentment. Not resentment for Vernon specifically. Resentment for what Vernon represented. Resentment for his refusal. Resentment that someone else had something that belonged to someone else, and that person was too stubborn to see reason. I pulled my hand away and set the watch down with shaking fingers. Then I heard footsteps, and I realized I'd made a serious mistake. I was standing in a dead man's shop, touching his belongings, with no legal right to be there, and no reasonable explanation for my presence. If I was caught, I'd spend my first week in Crabapple Bend explaining myself to law enforcement. I left quickly, locked the door between the shops, and went upstairs to my apartment where I sat with Quill and tried to slow my racing heartbeat. "The pocket watch," I whispered. Someone killed Vernon with the pocket watch, but not with the watch itself. With magic. Focused through the watch. Quill made a small sound of acknowledgement, which meant he'd probably already known this, and had been waiting for me to figure it out on my own. "And I think I know who did it," I continued, because the impression of resentment had been so specific, so familiar, that my psychometric sense had latched onto it. The woman who visited the shop yesterday, Miriam something, the one asking about Gretchen's inventory. For the first time since arriving in Crabapple Bend, I understood that I'd inherited something more than a shop. I'd inherited a way of understanding the world that went beyond forensic accounting or logical framework. I'd inherited the ability to see what others missed, and I'd just touched evidence at a murder scene. 4. Questions. I called B instead of calling the sheriff, which in retrospect was a poor decision, but at the time it seemed like the least likely way to get myself arrested. I think someone killed Vernon with magic, I said when she answered, and I think I know who did it. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, are you calling me from the apartment? Yes. I'm going to come over. Don't touch anything else. Don't tell anyone else. Don't call the sheriff. Just wait for me. Bee arrived 15 minutes later with her sugar glider in a carrier and an expression that suggested she was prepared to manage whatever breakdown I was currently experiencing. Tell me everything, she said, settling into the chair across from me. I explained psychometry, the emotions embedded in objects, the specific rage and resentment I'd felt from the pocket watch. I explained my theory about Miriam Goss, the way she'd asked about binding artifacts, the specificity of her interest in what Gretchen had collected. Bee listened without interrupting, her expression growing progressively more serious. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You have to tell Restrepo, she said finally. Not about touching the evidence, obviously, but about the rest of it. She'll think I'm insane. She'll think you're eccentric. Restrepo knows about magic. Restrepo knows about psychometrists. She'll listen. Bee paused. But you can't tell her you were in Vernon's shop. That's breaking and entering, and Restrepo takes evidence contamination very seriously. So I lied to a law enforcement officer? So you've learned something through psychometric study of items you shouldn't have touched, and now you report what you learned without disclosing how you learned it. Bee shrugged. Gretchen did it this way for years. It's not ideal, but it works. I spent the next hour preparing what I'd say to Restrepo, trying to frame the information in a way that sounded like legitimate investigation rather than touching evidence at a crime scene. I'd learned that Vernon had been killed with magic. I'd learned that someone with strong emotion toward him and toward binding artifacts had directed that magic. I'd learned enough to have reasonable suspicion about a suspect. The next morning, I called the sheriff's office and asked if she had time for a conversation. Restrepo met me at Petrichor Coffee, which seemed like neutral enough territory. She ordered coffee black, and I ordered chamomile tea because my stomach was too nervous for caffeine. I think Vernon was killed by magic, I said without preamble, and I think I can explain why. Restrepo didn't look surprised. She set down her coffee and pulled out her notebook, the picture of professional attention. The pocket watch in Vernon's shop, I continued, choosing my words with meticulous precision. When I touched it, during my psychometric examination of similar items in my own shop, I sensed specific emotional imprints: resentment, directed anger. Someone had focused powerful emotion through that object. You felt magical energy? Restrepo's eyes remained steady, which I was starting to understand was her baseline setting. I felt emotional imprints attached to the object, the kind of imprints that suggest magical work. I paused. Someone killed Vernon using magic, directed through a focus object. Why would someone do that? Binding artifacts, I said. Vernon had them. Someone wanted them badly enough to take action. I pulled out a piece of paper with notes I'd written. Miriam Goss visited my shop, asking specifically about my great-aunt's inventory of rare items. She was interested in binding artifacts. She asked if I had documentation about acquisition patterns. She seemed to know what she was looking for. Restrepo wrote everything down, her expression considering. What else? She visited Vernon's shop at some point. He refused to sell her what she wanted. That's what the resentment feels like. Refusal. Frustration that someone was being unreasonable. That's a lot of inference from a feeling, Restrepo said with steady composure. But it's useful. It gives me a direction to investigate. She closed her notebook. I'm going to ask you some direct questions now, and I want you to answer them honestly. Did you enter Vernon's shop at any point? Did you touch anything at the scene? I met her eyes, which was probably a mistake, but felt necessary. No, Sheriff. I examined items in my own shop. I didn't enter Vernon's shop. Good, she said. Because if you had, we'd have a contamination problem, and I'd have to take action about that. As it is, you've given me information that helps with my investigation. That's useful. I wasn't sure if she believed me, but she let the subject drop, which meant she was probably wise enough to understand that some information came from sources that would be inconvenient to examine too closely. Tell me more about binding artifacts, she said instead. I explained what I'd learned from Gretchen's ledger. Ancient protective magic built into the town, sustained through specific artifacts, guarded with meticulous attention. Binding artifacts weren't just rare, they were foundational. Someone acquiring them without authorization would be acquiring power that didn't belong to them. And Miriam? Restrepo asked. Has been in town for 15 years, I think. Is wealthy, or at least appears to be. Is interested in local history and collectible antiques. I pulled out the note Miriam had left in the faucet. This is from her. She knew Gretchen, apparently. She's offered to buy specific items. Restrepo photographed the note with her phone. I'll investigate Miriam with deliberate attention. In the meantime, I need you to do something for me. What? Nothing. She stood up to leave. Don't investigate. Don't touch evidence. Don't break into anyone's home. You come to me with information, and I handle the investigation from there. Understood? Understood, I said. Good. Because the last thing I need is an amateur psychometrist contaminating evidence because she thinks she's a detective. Restrepo paused at the coffee shop door. Welcome to Crabapple Bend, Ms. Vane. Try not to make my job harder than it already is. After she left, Bee set a fresh cup of chamomile in front of me. You just did the thing Gretchen always did, she said. You provided information through unofficial channels and let Restrepo do her job. That's how this works in Crabapple Bend. That's how breaking the law works in Crabapple Bend, I corrected. Semantics, Bee said cheerfully. Restrepo understands that psychometrists work differently than conventional investigators. She's willing to work with that, as long as you don't contaminate evidence beyond recovery. Over the next few days, I returned to routine. I organized the shop, worked on understanding the inventory, spent time with Quill. Restrepo was conducting interviews with Miriam and with other people in Vernon's life. The pocket watch had been collected as evidence. The investigation was moving forward through official channels, and I was trying very hard to not feel like I'd stumbled into something much larger than the simple act of running an antique shop. Desmond visited on Friday, ostensibly to discuss Gretchen's collection of local history texts, but actually to assess how I was handling the murder investigation. You did the right thing, reporting to Restrepo, he said, his expression measured. But you need to understand what you've started here. What do you mean? Gretchen understood the magical infrastructure of this town. She knew which artifacts were important, which people had significant abilities, where the power was concentrated. She used that knowledge to help maintain stability. He paused. You've inherited that knowledge. Whether you want it or not, people are going to start looking to you as part of that infrastructure. I've been here a week, I said. I don't understand anything. You understand enough to identify a killer, Desmond said. That's more than enough to get people's attention. Use that power with deliberate intention. After he left, I sat in the empty shop and tried to imagine what it meant to be responsible for a town's magical stability. The weight of it was substantial. The inadequacy I felt was even more substantial. Quill climbed onto the counter and made a small, encouraging sound. If I do something wrong, people could die, I said. He made another sound that suggested the bar for doing something wrong was higher than I thought. Woo. The collector. Miriam Goss paid a personal visit to the Fossick on Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after Vernon Crabbe's death. I was reorganizing the back room, moving items, examining them, building my own understanding of what Gretchen had collected and why, when the bell above the door chimed. I made my way to the front, expecting a customer, and found instead a woman in her 60s with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes, examining my inventory with the focus of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. "Theodora Vane?" she said when she noticed me. "I'm Miriam Goss. I was a friend of Gretchen's. We collected together, occasionally." My stomach tightened, but I kept my face composed. Jaw level, lips pressed flat, eyes steady. "Gretchen mentioned you in her notes." "Did she?" Miriam smiled. It was a practiced expression, warm without being genuine. "I hoped she would. Your great-aunt and I had a good relationship. I was devastated to hear about her death." Gretchen had died 6 months ago, and I wondered if Miriam had waited until now to approach the shop because she'd been waiting for her previous suspect, Vernon, to be removed from the equation. "What brings you in?" I asked. "I'm doing research into local collecting practices," Miriam said smoothly. "Specifically, items from the founding families. Gretchen had quite a collection of those pieces, and I was wondering if you'd be interested in discussing her acquisition history." "I'm still cataloging the inventory," I said. "I haven't gotten to specific acquisition information yet." "Of course. I understand completely." Miriam moved through the shop with casual purpose, examining items, picking some up, setting them down. "But when you do start organizing her records, I'd be very interested in hearing about any documents she maintained regarding provenance or acquisition dates." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, watching her with the practiced observation of someone who'd spent decades analyzing human behavior for fraud. Miriam was performing confidence, but underneath it was something tighter, something desperate. She was looking for something specific, and she thought I might have it. "The binding artifacts particularly," Miriam continued, picking up a small crystal. "Gretchen was meticulous about documenting those pieces. I'd be very interested in that documentation, from a historical perspective." I took the crystal gently from her hands. It was cold, and holding it made my spine straighten. "These aren't for sale," I said. "My great-aunt was very clear about that." "Of course not." Miriam smiled again, but her eyes were flat. "I wouldn't dream of asking. But documentation about their origins, that might be available for discussion?" "It might be," I said with meticulous precision, "but I'd need to understand the purpose of the research first." "I'm writing a book," Miriam said, "about the magical history of coastal Oregon. The binding artifacts are a significant part of that history. Gretchen's records would be invaluable to the project." The lie was smooth. It was also a lie. I could see it in the way she held herself, in the speed with which she'd pivoted when I rejected her request about the artifacts themselves. She wasn't writing a book. She was acquiring binding artifacts, and she'd been trying to do it through leverage and negotiation before resorting to whatever magical method she'd used to convince Vernon to stop resisting. "I'll look through Gretchen's files," I said, in a way that made it clear the conversation was over. "If I find anything relevant to your research, I'll be in touch." Miriam stayed in the shop for another 10 minutes, examining merchandise and asking meticulous questions about specific items. When she finally left, I made sure to lock the door behind her and watched from the window as she walked away with the gait of someone confident in her eventual success. I called Restrepo immediately. "Miriam Goss just visited the shop. She asked about binding artifacts and their acquisition history. She said she was writing a book, but I think that's inaccurate." "What makes you think she's lying?" Restrepo's voice was steady, but I could hear the interest underneath. "Because when I refused to provide information, she stopped asking about it. No one who's genuinely interested in research pivots away from a promising source that quickly. And because she was looking at me the way a forensic auditor looks at a balance sheet, trying to figure out what pieces I had access to and how she could leverage them. There was a pause. "You're good at reading people." "It's part of forensic accounting," I said. "You get very good at understanding motivation." "I appreciate your observations. I'm going to have another conversation with Ms. Goss." Restrepo hung up, leaving me standing in the shop with the distinct feeling that I'd just provided evidence that something I'd touched had confirmed her suspicions. That afternoon, I went through Gretchen's office more methodically, searching for anything related to binding artifacts. I found a locked box under the floorboards, a discovery that suggested my great-aunt had been taking her guardianship with serious dedication. Inside were documents in Gretchen's handwriting, artifact locations, maintenance records, protective spells, and a list of people who knew about the artifact's existence. Miriam's name was on that list, marked with a question mark and the notation, "Approach with caution." Interest pattern suggests acquisition intent rather than preservation. Vernon's name was also there, marked with a note, "Refuses to consider selling, protective, good." I photographed everything and sent the images to Restrepo with a note. "Found documentation among Gretchen's personal papers. This suggests she was concerned about acquisition pressure." The response came quickly. "Don't move or touch anything else related to binding artifacts. I'm building a case." That evening, I sat with Quill in the basement and tried to process what I'd discovered. Gretchen had been protecting something. Miriam had been trying to acquire it. Vernon had been standing in Miriam's way, and Miriam had responded by using magic to kill him. "The sheriff is going to arrest her," I told Quill, "but I need to understand what the binding artifacts actually are and why Miriam wants them so badly." Quill made a small sound that suggested I should probably go talk to someone who knew more than I did. I called Nolan Voss, the harbor master who apparently had water magic and had been willing to discuss the case with me before. The number wasn't in my phone, but it turned out the harbor master's office was only 3 blocks away. When I arrived at the harbor office at sunset, Nolan was closing up for the day. He was in his 50s, with weathered skin and eyes that held the particular clarity of someone who'd spent significant time looking at water. Next to him was a blue heron, impossibly large and intensely present. "Theodora," he said without surprise, "I wondered when you'd come asking questions again." "The sheriff is investigating Miriam," I said, "but I need to understand what the binding artifacts are and why someone would kill to acquire them." Nolan locked the office door and we walked toward the cove. The blue heron, barnacle he called it, pacing beside us with the gait of something that had walked this path 1,000 times before. "The binding is the protective spell that holds this town together," Nolan explained. "It was established 200 years ago by practitioners who understood what this place could become without protection. The ley line runs directly through Crabapple Bend. Without the binding, that power would be completely uncontrolled. People would go mad. Magic would be destructive instead of manageable." "And the artifacts?" 13 of them, distributed around the town. Each artifact anchors a specific part of the spell. Together, they maintain the binding. They're guarded by practitioners who understand what they're protecting. "Miriam wants to break the binding," I said, understanding flooding through me. "That's what she's been doing. Vernon had some of the artifacts. She was trying to acquire them, to weaken the spell." "Probably," Nolan said. "The binding is starting to fail naturally. 200 years of maintenance is reaching the end of its functional life. But accelerating that failure, unraveling it deliberately, that would be catastrophic." "Then we need to stop her." "The sheriff needs to stop her," Nolan corrected. "You need to stay out of this and let law enforcement handle it. The last thing this town needs is an amateur psychometrist becoming personally involved in a case involving our foundational protective magic." I wanted to argue, but he was right. I was untrained. I was new to town. And I didn't understand the magical implications of what Miriam was doing. What I understood was fraud and financial crime. And I understood that people who were desperate enough to kill would be desperate enough to do worse. Restrepo's building a case, I said. I've given her information. The rest is up to her. Nolan nodded, which seemed like he approved of my decision to step back. We stood at the harbor's edge as the fog began to roll in, arriving earlier than usual, maybe because the binding was damaged enough to destabilize the typical arrival patterns. When this is over, Nolan said quietly, people are going to understand that you're a part of this town's magical infrastructure now. You'll have choices about what role you want to play. Make those choices with deliberate intention. I'm still trying to figure out if I want to be here at all, I admitted. He smiled, which was rare and significant. Give it time. Crabapple Bend has a way of growing on people. As I walked back to the Fossick, I thought about infrastructure and protection, about the invisible magical systems that kept this strange town stable. I thought about Miriam, who wanted to break it, and Vernon, who died protecting it. And I thought about my own role in all of this, accidentally stumbling into a situation that required me to be braver than I felt. The binding would hold, I decided, because people like Gretchen and Vernon had understood what it meant to protect something larger than themselves. And people like me were going to have to learn that understanding too. 6. The Pocket Watch. The sheriff arrested Miriam Goss on a Tuesday evening, based on evidence I didn't have clearance to know about. I watched from the Fossick window as the patrol car pulled up to Miriam's house on the hill, watched as she was escorted into the car with her hands secure behind her back, watched as the town processed the information that one of its prominent residents was being charged with murder. By Wednesday morning, the entire town knew. By Thursday, people were taking sides, some defending Miriam, some defending Vernon's memory, all of them processing what it meant that someone they'd known had been capable of killing another person with magic. Sheriff Restrepo requested a formal meeting with me on Friday at the station, which was technically a converted Victorian house that now housed law enforcement, evidence, and a small jail in the basement. I want to walk you through the evidence, she said without preamble, so you understand how the case comes together, and why psychometric information is valuable, but not sufficient on its own. She showed me the pocket watch, now in an evidence bag. Your initial impression suggested someone directed magic through this object to stop Vernon's heart. That's a working hypothesis that makes sense, given the damage pattern in the shop and the magical disturbance we detected. The disturbance? I have practitioners on staff who can sense magical work, Restrepo explained. They detected a surge of directed energy at the time Vernon died. The pocket watch was at the epicenter of that surge. She showed me financial records. Miriam had been transferring large sums of money to someone called the Collector over the past 5 years. The amounts had increased significantly after Vernon refused to sell her his artifacts. She showed me phone records indicating that Miriam had called Vernon several times in the weeks before his death, and that the calls had grown increasingly tense. The pocket watch itself? Restrepo continued. We examined it for fingerprints. No partials match Miriam's, but we did find evidence of magical work. Our practitioners can see that sort of thing. Someone spent significant time enchanting this object, layering spells into it, preparing it to direct focused energy. Miriam, I said. Probably, Restrepo confirmed, but we can't prove it without her confession or additional evidence, which is where the confession comes in. Miriam, faced with the evidence, the artifacts in her home, the financial records, the testimony from people Restrepo had interviewed about her acquisition attempts, had decided that her legal options were limited. She'd confessed to killing Vernon using magic directed through the pocket watch, and had agreed to a plea deal that meant avoiding trial in exchange for accepting a lengthy sentence. So it's done, I said. So it's done, Restrepo agreed. And you did good work identifying her as a suspect. You provided information that allowed me to build a case. That's how investigation works in Crabapple Bend. Magical practitioners like you provide insights that conventional investigators can't, and then we handle the law enforcement side properly. I touched evidence, I said, because honesty seemed relevant. I was in Vernon's shop after he died. I touched the pocket watch. Restrepo looked at me without surprise. I assumed you had, but you left no trace evidence that would contaminate the case, and you reported your findings through appropriate channels. Gretchen did the same thing for years. It's not ideal, but it works if handled with meticulous attention. That's not how law enforcement is supposed to work. No, Restrepo agreed. But it's how law enforcement works in a town built on a magical ley line with a population that includes people with supernatural abilities. We make accommodations for reality. After the meeting, I walked back through town feeling oddly unmoored. The case was solved. The killer was caught. My role in Crabapple Bend should have been simple. Run the shop, use my psychometric ability to help when it was useful, live a quiet life. Except that Miriam's arrest had changed something fundamental. People looked at me differently now. They recognized me as someone who could sense things they couldn't. And that recognition created expectation. Bea noticed it too. "You're getting famous," she said that afternoon at Petrichor Coffee. "People are talking about how you solved Vernon's murder. Some of them are wondering if you'd be interested in helping them with other things." Other things? Finding lost items, understanding the history of inherited objects, determining if people are being truthful about the provenance of antiques. She shrugged. Basically, people want to use your ability to solve problems that they can't solve themselves. That's not what I came here for. I know, Bea said kindly, but that's what's happening anyway. That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding since the investigation started. I cleaned out the pocket watch, removing the evidence bags and magical detritus that still clung to it. The object was cold in my hands, and holding it made my skin prickle. But this time, I pushed past the physical discomfort and tried to understand what I was actually feeling. The rage was gone. Without the emotion fueling it, the pocket watch was just an object. Beautiful, old, crafted with skill and attention. Someone had made this watch, decades or centuries ago. Someone had held it, checked it, relied on it. And then Miriam had taken it and filled it with directed fury and used it to end a person's life. I sat with that understanding for a long time, my hand wrapped around the watch, my mind processing the weight of it. Quill joined me on the counter, his small body warm against my palm. His presence was steadying in a way I was starting to understand. Familiars were connected to their practitioners. They carried our emotions, reflected our state, provided grounding when everything felt untethered. "I don't want to be the town's psychometrist," I said aloud. "I just want to run a shop." Quill made a sound that suggested the two things might not be mutually exclusive, but that one of them was definitely going to happen regardless of my preferences. Over the next week, people started visiting the Fossick with specific requests. Could I touch this object and tell them where it came from? Could I sense if this item was authentic? Could I help resolve a dispute about the provenance of a family heirloom? I said yes to some of them, no to others. I was learning how to set boundaries around my ability, understanding that I couldn't use it to solve every problem, that sometimes people needed to sit with uncertainty. On Friday evening, when the fog rolled in at its usual arrival time and Desmond arrived asking to discuss binding artifacts, I was ready for the conversation in a way I hadn't been a week ago. "The binding needs repairs," he said without preamble. "Miriam's attempted unraveling was partially successful. The spell is weakened, and we need to start planning a renewal ritual." "That's not my responsibility," I said. "No," Desmond agreed. "But you're part of this town's magical infrastructure now. You're a psychometrist, which means you can help identify which artifacts are most damaged. We'll need your insight to prioritize repairs." "I just want to run a shop." You can do both, Desmond said, echoing Quill's earlier implication. Many practitioners do. Gretchen ran the Fossick and served on the town council. You can run the Fossick and help maintain the binding. These things aren't mutually exclusive. By the end of the conversation, I'd agreed to work with Desmond on identifying which of the binding artifacts needed immediate attention. By the end of that project, I understood that Crabapple Bend wasn't just my inheritance, it was my responsibility. And the weight of that responsibility was substantial, but somehow also exactly right. 7. Tides. The binding artifacts were distributed around Crabapple Bend in a pattern that Desmond explained was based on the ley line's flow and the gravitational pull of the cove. One artifact was in the blue building that the fog moved around, a crystal the size of my fist, guarded by a practitioner named Patricia, whose age was indeterminate but whose knowledge was absolute. Another was in the town archives, another in the Grange Hall basement, others distributed through various buildings and private homes. Gretchen had maintained meticulous records of every artifact's location and condition. I had access to those records now, which meant Desmond and I could systematically check each one and assess the damage from Miriam's partial unraveling. The first artifact I examined was the crystal in Patricia's building. Patricia was in her 70s or maybe older, with silver hair and eyes that had the particular clarity of someone who'd spent decades mediating between magical forces and human needs. "The crystal is compromised," she said, showing me the object. It was beautiful. Rose quartz, old enough that it had developed a subtle internal pattern like frost on glass. When I touched it, the impression was of deep calm, of something designed to dampen chaotic energy. Not destroyed, but weakened. The protective effect is reduced by approximately 30%. "Can it be repaired?" I asked. "Possibly. The binding renewal ritual will help stabilize it, but we may need to supplement it with additional protective work." Patricia accepted the crystal back from my hands. Miriam was meticulous. She didn't just try to break the binding outright. She weakened it with systematic precision, hoping the degradation would eventually cause it to fail on its own. Over the course of 2 weeks, I examined 7 of the 13 artifacts. Each one showed signs of damage consistent with systematic magical attack. Each one would require work to repair. The spring equinox, the next major magical turning point, was 4 months away. That would be the ideal time for a binding renewal ritual, but it would require preparation and coordination of practitioners from across the region. I was sitting in the basement of the Fossick, surrounded by Gretchen's notes about binding magic, when Nolan appeared at the shop door with the blue heron in tow. "Desmond said you'd been examining artifacts," he said. "I thought you might want some additional context about the binding's relationship to the harbor's tidal patterns." I'd been learning that Crabapple Bend operated on multiple systems of magic. The binding was the primary protection, but there were secondary systems tied to water, to the crabapple tree in the square, to the natural ley line that ran beneath the town. Understanding how these systems interconnected was more complex than I'd anticipated. "Vernon was killed around 7:15 p.m., I said, following a thought that had been nagging at me. "The tidal charts you showed me before. There was something significant about that time, wasn't there?" "High tidal moment," Nolan confirmed, moving to the bookshelf to examine Desmond's research materials. "Not actual high tide, but a secondary peak related to the moon phase and the season. Water magic is strongest at tidal transitions." "So Miriam chose to kill Vernon at a time when water magic would be amplified," I said slowly. "That suggests her spellwork was sophisticated. She wasn't just using the pocket watch as a focus, she was layering her spell into the tidal cycle." "Exactly," Nolan said. "Which explains why the magical disturbance was so strong, and why it caused such visible physical damage to the shop. She was using the tidal surge to amplify her personal magic, directing it through the pocket watch to Vernon's heart." How did she know how to do that? I asked. That level of magical sophistication shouldn't be possible for someone without serious training. It's not, Nolan said, which means Miriam either has significant magical education we don't know about, or she was working with someone who does. I went immediately to Restrepo with this information, and for the first time since the investigation began, I saw her expression shift from professional composure to genuine concern. We didn't ask about that, she admitted. We assumed she was acting alone. You should ask, I said. Whoever taught her how to layer magic into tidal cycles is sophisticated enough to be dangerous. If they're still in the area, I'll interview her again, Restrepo said, picking up her phone. Thank you for the insight. 2 hours later, Miriam admitted under questioning that she had been working with someone called the Collector. She claimed not to know the Collector's real identity, said the relationship was entirely transactional. The Collector provided magical training and binding artifact acquisition advice, and Miriam provided payment and assistance with acquisitions. The Collector is the real threat, Restrepo said, briefing me after the interview. Miriam was the operative on the ground, but she was following instructions. The Collector is the person who orchestrated Vernon's death and the binding's destabilization. Did she tell you who the Collector is? No, and I'm not certain she actually knows. The communications were encrypted, the meetings were in public places where no one was observant. The payment transfers went through multiple channels. Restrepo looked exhausted in a way that suggested the case had just become significantly more complicated. This isn't finished, Teddy. This is just the beginning. I spent that evening sitting with Quill, trying to process the implications. Someone intelligent, trained, dangerous was still out there. Someone who understood binding magic well enough to teach Miriam how to unravel it. Someone who wanted the artifacts badly enough to plan Vernon's death as part of a larger strategy. We need to strengthen the binding before the Collector makes another move, I said. Can we do that? Can we advance the renewal ritual to winter instead of spring? Quill made a sound that suggested that was a question for someone more experienced than a hedgehog. I called Desmond and posed the question. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. Technically, yes. A binding renewal ritual is tied to equinoxes, which provide powerful transitional energy. Winter solstice provides different energy, more inward-focused, more about foundation. It could work, but we'd have to build the ritual specifically for winter magic instead of spring magic. That's not trivial. But it's possible? It's possible, Desmond agreed. I'll need to consult with the other practitioners. We'll have to assess whether we have the capability to do this with safety. Then do it, I said. Because whoever the Collector is, they're going to make another move, and we need the binding to be as strong as possible when they do. By the end of the week, the decision had been made. The binding renewal would take place on the winter solstice, 7 weeks away. That meant finding all 13 artifacts, assessing their damage, planning a coordinated ritual that would require magical practitioners from across the region to participate. It also meant that Crabapple Bend was going to be very busy for the next 2 months. I reorganized the Fossick again, this time creating a space where practitioners could bring artifacts for assessment. I was busy, busier than I'd ever been in my accounting career, and somehow, for the first time since arriving in town, I felt like I understood my purpose. Not just running a shop, not just being a psychometrist, but being part of something larger, maintaining the magical infrastructure that kept Crabapple Bend safe and stable. It was responsibility and burden and privilege all tangled together. Quill pressed against my leg in the evening, his small body warm, his presence steady. He'd known I was meant for this, I realized. He'd probably known it since I arrived, had been waiting for me to understand it too. Thank you, I whispered to him, for being patient while I figured it out. He made a small sound that suggested patience was a virtue he possessed in abundance, and I'd better get used to relying on it. 8. Suspects. As winter deepened, Crabapple Bend filled with practitioners from across Oregon and into Northern California. They came to help with the binding renewal ritual, to assess artifacts, to coordinate magical work. The town's population roughly tripled, and the Fossick became a de facto community center for magical discussion and planning. I was learning what Gretchen had understood about running a magic shop. It wasn't just about selling antiques. It was about being a space where people gathered, shared information, worked through problems together. I started keeping tea brewing at all hours. I expanded the seating area. I opened my apartment to group conversations that ran late into the evening, and through it all, I was watching for signs that the collector might make another move. "You're too obvious about it," Desmond told me. "Stop looking like you're expecting an attack." "An attack is coming," I said. "The collector isn't finished. Miriam's arrest probably just accelerated their timeline." "True," Desmond said. "But staring at people like they're suspects isn't going to help you identify which one actually is suspicious." I tried to be more subtle, but subtlety wasn't my strong suit. I was a forensic accountant. I was trained to follow paper trails and identify discrepancies. I was trained to notice when numbers didn't add up. Noticing people's behavior patterns was harder because people were complex in ways that financial records weren't. Nolan arrived on a Tuesday with news that made everything worse. "The collector has been contacting Miriam. Restrepo showed me encrypted messages that were intercepted. They're discussing next steps for acquiring binding artifacts." "How is Miriam contacting anyone?" I asked. "She's in custody." "She's providing information about where the remaining artifacts are located. In exchange, the collector is apparently arranging for her sentence to be lighter, or for her imprisonment to be more comfortable, or something. The point is, they're still working together." "Then we need to strengthen security around the artifacts," I said. "We're already doing that," Desmond said, arriving just behind Nolan. "Patricia is organizing a rotating watch schedule. Practitioners will be stationed at each artifact location, 24 hours a day. But you need to understand, this is going to change the ritual dynamics. Having practitioners constantly near the artifacts will create magical interference. It might affect the renewal's effectiveness." "Then the collector could be counting on that," I said. "Could be intentionally pushing us into doing something that weakens the binding further while we're trying to repair it." "Possibly," Desmond said, "but Miriam's arrest already weakened our timeline. We don't have the luxury of planning forever. We have to move forward with the ritual and do the best we can." That evening, I made a list of everyone who'd been in Crabapple Bend since Miriam's arrest. The list was long. I'd met dozens of practitioners, all of them with their own reasons for being in town, all of them with access to some part of the binding's infrastructure. "The collector could be anyone," I said to Quill. "Could be someone I've already met. Could be someone who's pretending to help with the ritual but is actually working against it." Quill made a sound that suggested I was spiraling, and that spiraling wasn't useful. He was right. I needed to think like a forensic accountant. I needed to follow the patterns that didn't make sense, identify the discrepancies. I called Restrepo. "Can I see Miriam's financial records? Complete ones, going back years?" "Why?" Restrepo asked. "Because the collector is communicating with Miriam from outside the system, which means they're confident they won't be traced. That suggests either someone with significant technological sophistication or someone working through channels that are already encrypted and hidden. Either way, there should be evidence of that in Miriam's financial history. Either payments that don't make sense or absences of payments where they should be. Either way, a forensic accountant should be able to identify the pattern." Restrepo got me the records 2 hours later. I sat in my apartment, surrounded by bank statements and financial transfers, and I did what I'd been trained to do. I built a picture of Miriam's financial life, examined the unusual transactions, identified the patterns that didn't fit. There were regular payments to something called Antiquities Restoration Services that didn't correspond to any actual restoration work. There were transfers to a consulting firm that had no office, no employees, no traceable existence. There were cryptocurrency transactions that were designed to obscure the recipient's identity. But there was also a pattern. Every payment happened on specific dates. The dates corresponded to magical transitions: new moon, full moon, equinox, solstice. The collector was operating on a magical calendar, which meant they understood binding magic deeply, which meant they were probably a practitioner, not someone working from the outside. I compiled all of this into a report and sent it to Restrepo, along with a note. The collector is someone who understands binding magic, someone sophisticated enough to operate encrypted systems, someone with access to the magical calendar that governs when binding magic is strongest. This significantly narrows your suspect pool. Over the next week, Restrepo interviewed every single practitioner who was in Crabapple Bend for the ritual. She asked questions about their financial history, their background with binding magic, their connection to Miriam. She cross-referenced information with law enforcement in other jurisdictions, and she came up empty. The collector has to be someone local, she said, frustration clear in her voice. Someone who knows the binding deeply, has been planning this long term, has resources to avoid detection. But I can't identify them. Then we're missing something, I said. What's the gap? What pattern isn't making sense? We sat together in Restrepo's office, surrounded by files and notes, trying to build a profile of someone we couldn't see. And slowly, the absence began to make sense. The collector has to know about Miriam before Vernon died, I said. Has to have been working with her for years, based on the payment pattern. So whoever they were already in the town before Vernon was killed. They were already part of the magical community. That's what I've been assuming, Restrepo said, but I can't identify them. Then maybe the identity isn't what we should be focusing on, I suggested. Maybe we should be focusing on the next target. What's the collector going to do after the winter solstice? What's their endgame? Over the following days, we tried to think like the collector. They wanted binding artifacts. They wanted to destabilize the binding. They'd been working toward that goal for years. What came after the binding was destabilized. Maybe they want to replace it, Desmond suggested when I asked him. Maybe they're trying to build a new binding, with themselves as the primary anchor. That would give them control over the magical energy flowing through Crabapple Bend. That would require access to all 13 artifacts, I said. And it would require knowledge of binding magic that... I stopped, because realization was beginning to dawn. I'd been thinking about this wrong. I'd been assuming the collector was someone I should know about, someone prominent in the magical community. But what if they were someone I didn't know? What if they were someone who'd stayed hidden specifically because they understood that being visible made you vulnerable? I need to examine something, I told Restrepo, something I've been overlooking. I went back to the faucet and pulled out Gretchen's ledger. She'd kept meticulous notes about everyone who knew about the binding, everyone who was involved in maintaining it, but she'd also kept notes about people who shouldn't know about it but might find out anyway. She'd tracked threats, monitored suspicious activity, documented every interaction that felt even slightly concerning. There was an entry from 2 years ago. Visitor requesting binding artifact identification, claims academic interest but shows knowledge inconsistent with academic background, referred to others more knowledgeable. Follow up in 6 months. The follow-up entry said, still monitoring. Sources suggest increased interest in binding mechanics. Recommend close observation. But there was no name, just a notation. Unknown practitioner. High capability. Possibly working toward acquisition. This has to be the collector, I said to Restrepo, showing her the entry. Gretchen identified them 2 years ago but couldn't confirm identity, which means they've been hidden successfully for a minimum of 2 years. Then they're good at staying invisible, Restrepo said, which means we're going to have to be proactive instead of reactive. We're going to have to make them visible. How? I asked. By protecting the artifact so effectively that they're forced to make a move, Restrepo said. By making it clear that the binding renewal is going to succeed, and by cutting off all of Miriam's access to communicate from custody. We push them into acting, and then we catch them when they do. It was a plan that sounded reasonable, except for one fundamental flaw. It meant using ourselves as bait. It meant making the binding vulnerable specifically so that someone dangerous would have to surface to attack it. It meant accepting significant risk in order to identify and apprehend someone who was already proving very difficult to catch. But it was the only plan we had. Divini. Archives. The town archives occupied a renovated Victorian mansion on the edge of Crabapple Bend, 3 blocks from the Fossick. One of the binding artifacts, a piece of iron worked into a shape that suggested both a key and a tree, was stored in the basement, guarded behind multiple layers of protection and watched continuously by a rotating team of practitioners. I arrived for my shift on a Thursday evening, taking over from someone named Marcus who'd been monitoring the artifact since dawn. Marcus was in his 40s, with the meticulous demeanor of someone who took responsibility with serious dedication. "Nothing unusual today," he said, briefing me as he gathered his coat. "The artifact is stable. The protective wards are all functioning. Desmond's been here twice to check the renewal ritual preparations." I nodded and settled into the chair that had been placed in the archive's basement. 12 hours stretched ahead of me, a long evening and night of sitting alone with one of the binding artifacts, maintaining vigilance against the collector's potential move. The basement was temperature-controlled and meticulously organized. The artifact was housed in a crystal display case that amplified its magical signature, making it easier to detect if anyone tried to interfere with it. I had a notebook, a thermos of tea, and clear instructions. Observe, document, call Restrepo immediately if anything felt unusual. By midnight, I'd filled 3 pages with observations about the artifact's magical signature, the subtle shifts in energy, the way the light reflected off the crystal case differently at various times, the small sounds the building made as it settled into sleep. I'd also analyzed my own mental state, which was becoming increasingly paranoid and tired. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the stairs. They were deliberate and unhurried, the footsteps of someone who belonged in the building and had no intention of hiding their presence. I called Restrepo immediately, then stood up and positioned myself between the stairs and the artifact, adrenaline sharpening every sense. The person who descended was older, perhaps 70, with silver hair and a kind expression that immediately made me second-guess my fear response. She was wearing pajamas and carried a mug of tea. "I'm Eleanor," she said, not surprised to see me. "I'm the archivist here. I live in the apartment upstairs. I saw the light on and thought I should investigate." "I'm monitoring the artifact," I said, "as part of the security rotation for the binding renewal." Eleanor nodded like this made perfect sense. "That's good." Desmond explained the arrangement. "I just wanted to introduce myself and offer you more tea if you needed it." She stayed for 20 minutes, discussing the archive's history and the binding artifact's provenance. She was genuinely kind, genuinely interested in the work I was doing. And when she left, I felt ridiculous for having been afraid of her. Restrepo called 5 minutes after Eleanor went back upstairs. "False alarm?" "Just the archivist," I confirmed. "Couldn't sleep." "Then get some rest if you can. You've got 6 more hours." By the time my shift ended at 8 a.m., I'd watched the dawn light gradually fill the basement, and I'd convinced myself that the collector wasn't going to make a move. They were too sophisticated, too hidden, too strategic to risk exposure over a single artifact, which meant we were going to have to adjust our approach. I met with Desmond, Nolan, and Restrepo at Petrichor Coffee that morning. We sat in a corner booth, away from other customers, and discussed strategy. The collector isn't going to attack the artifacts directly, I said. They know we're monitoring them. They know we're expecting an assault. Then what will they do? Desmond asked. Something indirect, I said. Something that works around our defenses. Maybe targeting a practitioner instead of an artifact. Maybe interfering with the ritual preparations rather than the binding itself. Then we increase practitioner protection, Nolan said. We identify who's most essential to the ritual and make sure they're safe. That might push the collector into acting, Restrepo said. If we make it clear that certain people are critical to the ritual's success, the collector might try to neutralize them. Which means we use them as bait, I said, understanding the strategy. We make it look like there's someone vulnerable, we let the collector come at them, and we arrest them when they do. Yes, Restrepo said. But we need volunteers, people who are willing to accept increased danger. That afternoon, we met with the core group of practitioners coordinating the ritual. Desmond, Patricia, Nolan, and 2 others I'd come to know over the past weeks. A woman named Sarah who worked with earth magic and a man named James who understood the ley line deeply. We need a target, Desmond explained. Someone the collector would consider important enough to attack. Someone visible as critical to the ritual. That should be me, Sarah said immediately. I'm coordinating the earth magic components. Without those, the ritual won't hold. I'm the obvious target. Or me, James said. The ley line work is essential. If the collector interferes with that, the ritual fails. Restrepo coordinated security arrangements. Sarah and James would continue their work publicly, letting everyone see how central they were to the ritual's success. Simultaneously, security would be increased around them. Officers posted discreetly, magical practitioners stationed nearby, constant monitoring. And we waited. The days passed in a strange combination of routine and tension. I worked at the Fossick during the day, monitoring the people who came in for psychometric readings or artifact assessment. I participated in ritual preparation in the evenings. I sat with one of the binding artifacts each night, maintaining vigilance in case anything unusual occurred, and nothing happened. A week passed, then 2 weeks. The winter solstice was approaching, 8 days away, and the collector still hadn't made a move. They know we're prepared, I said to Restrepo. They're not going to attack. They're going to wait until after the ritual, when we're vulnerable and celebrating and less guarded. Then we adjust the timeline, Restrepo said. The ritual happens on the solstice. We make it public. We invite the entire town. We make it clear that this is a major magical event. And we watch for who's not there, who's acting suspiciously, who's working to disrupt instead of celebrate. The collector will be there, I said, understanding. They won't be able to resist. They'll come to see what they've failed to prevent, to assess how damaged the binding actually is. Exactly, Restrepo said, and we'll identify them. For the first time since we'd started looking, I felt like we might actually catch them. 10. Confrontation. The winter solstice arrived on a gray day that felt like the whole world was waiting for something to happen. By evening, when the ritual was scheduled to begin, Crabapple Bend was filled with people, not just practitioners, but townspeople who wanted to witness the binding renewal. There must have been 500 people gathered in Crabapple Square, standing in the cold, waiting. The ritual was beautiful in a way I hadn't anticipated. The 13 artifacts were arranged in a circle around the central crabapple tree. 13 practitioners stood at each artifact, their hands glowing with colored light. Patricia with rose quartz energy, Sarah with earth brown light, James with silver ley line brightness. Desmond stood at the center, speaking words in a language that sounded older than English, his voice carrying power that made the air vibrate. As he spoke, light began to flow from each artifact toward the center, connecting at the crabapple tree. The tree bloomed silver flowers that fell like snow, and with each flower the binding strengthened. I could feel it, the way the protective magic settled deeper into Crabapple Bend, the way the town's magical foundation solidified. The spell was renewing itself, anchoring itself in the winter solstice energy, preparing to hold for another 200 years. It was magnificent. And that's when I noticed someone's energy was wrong. One of the practitioners standing at an artifact, someone I recognized as the town council secretary named Harrison, was directing energy differently than the others. While the other 13 were channeling power into the renewal, Harrison was pulling power out, subtly draining it, working against the ritual in a way that most people wouldn't notice. I caught Restrepo's eye across the square. She was already moving, already signaling to officers positioned around the crowd. We'd planned for this. Whoever the collector was, they'd probably try to sabotage the ritual from within. The ritual completed before Restrepo could reach Harrison, the final flowers falling, the binding settling into place. The crowd erupted into cheers and celebration, and in that moment of distraction, Harrison ran. He moved with the purpose of someone who'd been planning an escape route for months. He pushed through the crowd, heading for the harbor, and I followed on instinct rather than strategy. I wasn't trained for this. I was a forensic accountant, but I was faster than most people, and I was motivated by the understanding that this man, this collector, had orchestrated a murder and had been trying to destroy the magical foundations of my town. He reached the harbor and turned toward the cliffs, toward the stairs that led down to the cove. Restrepo and her deputies were maybe 30 seconds behind me, but that was 30 seconds he didn't have. Harrison descended the stairs at a run, and I followed, my feet skidding on stone, my heart in my throat. The cove at the bottom was a place I'd never been before, a hidden pocket of ocean accessible only from these stairs. The cliffs rose up on 3 sides, and the water was dark and cold in the winter evening. Harrison stopped at the water's edge and turned to face me. His expression was calm, which was somehow more frightening than panic would have been. "You're not trained for this," he said. "You're a forensic accountant who inherited a shop. You should go back to the square and let the sheriff handle this." "You killed Vernon," I said. "Vernon was an obstacle," Harrison said with chilling precision. He'd accepted the binding as it was. He didn't understand that we could create something better, something with intention instead of accident, something with a chosen architect instead of historical inheritance. You wanted to break the binding so you could build your own. I wanted to free this town from a spell that was designed 200 years ago for a different purpose, by people who didn't understand what Crabapple Bend could become. He took a step toward the water. "Miriam was useful, but she wasn't essential. I can accomplish this alone." Restrepo emerged from the stairs behind me, her weapon drawn, her expression focused. "Harrison Webb, you're under arrest for the murder of Vernon Crabbe, conspiracy, and attempted magical sabotage of protected infrastructure." Harrison smiled like he'd been expecting exactly this outcome. "I'm also going to commit suicide rather than spend the rest of my life in a cell." He stepped backward into the water. I didn't think. I moved on instinct, grabbed his arm, tried to pull him back to shore. He was stronger than I expected, or I was weaker, and he was dragging me toward the water along with him. Restrepo was reaching for him. Quill, I didn't know he'd followed me, launched himself at Harrison's face with the fury of a small, protective predator. Nolan appeared at the top of the stairs with Barnacle, and water magic flowed down the cliff face like a barrier between Harrison and the ocean. Harrison stumbled back, disoriented by the assault of animal and magic. Restrepo tackled him, and deputies secured his hands before he could do anything else. The moment he was restrained, the tension of the day collapsed. I sat down hard on the rocks, my legs no longer capable of supporting my weight. Quill climbed into my lap, his small body shaking from adrenaline. "You're an idiot," Nolan said, coming to stand over me, following a desperate suspect to a cliff's edge. "He was getting away," I said weakly. "The sheriff was right behind you. You didn't need to follow. You just needed to not get in the way." But he was helping me up, his hand solid under my arm, and his expression was more concerned than angry. As they took Harrison away, I stood in the cove with Quill pressed against my chest and Nolan at my side. The binding had held. The ritual was complete. The town was safe. And I'd survived my first real confrontation with genuine danger. "Are you okay?" Nolan asked quietly. "No," I said. "I don't think I am. But I will be." He smiled, and it felt like approval. "Shi." The gap. Harrison Webb was held in custody pending trial, and the revelation that the town council secretary had been orchestrating a murder investigation created a weird social awkwardness around Crabapple Bend. People didn't quite know how to process the fact that someone they saw regularly at council meetings had been secretly planning to destroy the town's magical foundation. I spent the days after the solstice trying to process everything that had happened: the successful ritual, the collector's identity, the knowledge that I'd almost gone into the ocean chasing someone who was more dangerous than I'd realized. Restrepo came to the Fossick on the Wednesday after the arrest with documents for me to review. "Harrison's been running financial operations for the town for the past 8 years," she said. "He had access to all the budgetary information, all the planning documents for the binding renewal, access to the artifact's locations. He was positioned perfectly to orchestrate everything." "Why did he do it?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "He believed the binding was limiting Crabapple Bend's potential," Restrepo said. "He wanted to replace it with something that would allow him to be the central authority in a new magical structure. Basically, he wanted power." "Most people who commit murder do," I said. "They want power, or control, or something they've convinced themselves they need enough to justify killing." "You sound like you've dealt with this before." "Forensic accounting is partly about understanding motivation," I explained. "People who commit financial fraud are usually rational right up until they aren't. They do the math, they decide the benefit outweighs the risk, and then they commit." Harrison did the same thing, except with magic instead of money. Over the next few weeks, the town returned to something resembling normal. The binding had been renewed and was stable. The collector had been apprehended. The mystery was solved, and people could return to their lives without the underlying anxiety that someone was threatening the town's magical infrastructure. I returned to running the Fossick and doing psychometric readings. I helped practitioners prepare for spring, when the ley line's energy would shift again. I sat with Quill in the evenings and tried to feel like I was part of Crabapple Bend in a way that went beyond solving murders. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Bea asked me one afternoon, refilling my teacup at Petrichor Coffee. "No," I said, and meant it. My old life was about tracking other people's fraudulent activities. I was good at it, but I was also invisible. No one knew me. No one cared if I succeeded or failed as long as the money balanced. And now? Now I'm part of something. I understand what I'm doing matters. The town depends on what I know." I paused. That's terrifying sometimes, but it's also the most purposeful I've ever felt. Bea smiled. "That's how most of us feel about Crabapple Bend." The case against Harrison Webb progressed through the legal system. He'd confessed to Vernon's death, had admitted his involvement in attempting to destabilize the binding, had provided detailed information about his long-term plans. The district attorney had what amounted to an open and shut case. What complicated matters was the magical component. How exactly do you prosecute someone for using enchanted artifacts as weapons? What legal precedent exists for sabotaging a protective spell? The prosecutors and the defense team had to invent frameworks that had never been used before. But eventually, about 2 months after his arrest, Harrison was sentenced to 40 years in a high-security facility with magical monitoring. He'd attempted to appeal on the grounds that the magical components of his crimes should have made them federal matters. But the court had ruled that magical crimes affecting magical infrastructure were under local jurisdiction. The sentencing was anticlimactic. I attended because Restrepo asked me to, and because I wanted to see that the legal system could actually hold people accountable for what they'd done. Harrison stood in the small courtroom, looking exactly as calm as he'd been standing at the cliff's edge, and accepted his sentence with the expression of someone who'd made peace with the consequences of his actions. Justice, Restrepo said afterward, though her tone suggested she understood that justice was more complicated than courtroom pronouncements made it sound. Not perfect, but sufficient. That evening, I made a decision. I called the town council and asked to be officially hired as a consultant to the binding renewal and maintenance program. The position would be part-time, would involve examining binding artifacts for damage, providing psychometric insights about objects involved in magical investigations, and generally serving as a bridge between the practitioners and the conventional law enforcement community. The council voted unanimously to accept. Desmond and I celebrated with tea at the Fossick, along with Patricia, Nolan, and a few other practitioners who'd become genuine friends over the past months. You've integrated into Crabapple Bend's magical infrastructure faster than anyone I've ever seen, Patricia said. Usually it takes years for new practitioners to understand how to work within the system. I had motivation, I said. Someone killed my neighbor, and I had the ability to help solve it. That tends to accelerate learning. That's true, Patricia said. But you also listened. You asked questions. You were willing to admit when you didn't understand something. Not everyone does that. After they left, I sat with Quill and thought about what the next season would bring. Spring was coming, which meant the ley line's energy would shift again. The binding would need ongoing maintenance. New practitioners would probably come to town as the word spread about Crabapple Bend's magical infrastructure and the people who maintained it. Life would be busier, more complex, more demanding than it had been when I first arrived, but it would also be full of purpose. Thank you, I said to Quill for approximately the 100th time since arriving in town. For making sure I came here. For being patient while I figured out what I was supposed to do. He made a small sound that suggested gratitude wasn't necessary when the work was this important. I scratched behind his ears, and he made a satisfied sound that suggested he approved of my effort, even if it could never truly be adequate to his tastes. The fog rolled in at 6:17 p.m., right on schedule, and I watched from the Fossick window feeling like I was finally exactly where I was supposed to be. Sure. Proof. The spring equinox arrived with unusual clarity, clear skies instead of the usual fog, bright sunshine that made Crabapple Bend look almost quaint. The town's magical practitioners were preparing for the ley line's seasonal shift, which would require minor adjustments to the binding, regular maintenance work that was less dramatic than a full renewal, but equally essential. I'd been meeting with Desmond weekly, learning the theoretical foundations of binding magic, understanding how the spell worked and what components made it effective. The knowledge was dense and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also exactly what I needed to understand my role in Crabapple Bend's magical infrastructure. One afternoon, while we were reviewing artifact maintenance records, Desmond mentioned something that seemed tangential, but made my entire understanding of the situation shift. Harrison's original plan was supposed to span 7 years. He was going to gradually weaken the binding, position himself as the expert who could fix it, and eventually assume control of the magical infrastructure. That's ambitious, I said. That's patient, Desmond corrected. Most people who seek power want it immediately. Harrison understood that real power comes from being trusted, from being seen as essential. He was willing to work years to achieve that position. But he accelerated when Vernon refused to cooperate. I said, "Yes, that was his critical error. He let frustration override planning, and that's what got him caught." That evening, I was going through the court documents from Harrison's case, because I'm meticulous, and because understanding exactly how he'd operated felt important, when I noticed something that didn't make sense. Harrison's financial records showed that he'd been transferring money into accounts that belonged to various town practitioners. Small amounts, nothing dramatic, but regular and consistent transfers that looked like payment for services or goods. I asked Restrepo about it. "We assumed those were legitimate," she said, "but I can check. Why does it concern you?" "Because it's odd," I said. Harrison was trying to keep his activities hidden, but he was making regular financial transfers to people. That's a liability. That's evidence. If he was truly meticulous, he wouldn't have left that kind of trail. Restrepo investigated and discovered that Harrison had been paying various practitioners for information about the binding's maintenance schedule, the locations of artifacts, and the plans for the renewal ritual. Some of the practitioners had accepted the money without realizing what they were paying for. Some had been knowingly cooperating with his plan. So Harrison wasn't working alone, Restrepo said. He had assistants. "Not assistants," I said. "Information sources. He was building a network of people who were invested in his success because he was paying them." The investigation expanded to include interviews with the practitioners who'd received money from Harrison. Most of them claimed ignorance. They'd thought they were providing routine information, didn't realize how it was being used. One or two admitted to knowing more than they'd initially disclosed. Restrepo prosecuted them for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, but the charges were misdemeanor level rather than felonies. They received probation and community service, which felt inadequate, but was better than nothing. The publicity around the expanded investigation made people nervous. If Harrison had been able to recruit allies, who else might be working toward their own agenda? Who else might be trying to manipulate Crabapple Bend's magical infrastructure for personal gain? I addressed this concern at a town meeting in early May, about 6 months after Vernon's death. "The binding is stable," I told the assembled crowd. "The renewal was successful. The magical infrastructure is functioning as designed. What happened with Harrison Webb was an anomaly. A single person who wanted to redirect power, who is willing to break laws and take lives to achieve their goal. But he's been caught, he's been imprisoned, and the people he'd recruited have been identified." "How do we prevent this from happening again?" someone asked. "By continuing what we've always done," I said. "By maintaining the artifacts, monitoring the binding, and staying alert to unusual activity. Magic in Crabapple Bend works because people who understand it care about protecting it. That hasn't changed. That won't change." I meant what I said, but I also understood that being vigilant would now be part of my role. I'd have to pay attention not just to magical work, but to the people doing that work, making sure their intentions were aligned with protecting the town rather than exploiting its magical foundation. It was an added responsibility that I hadn't anticipated when I first arrived. After the meeting, Nolan walked me back to the Fossick. The evening was mild, spring warm, and the flowers in the town square were beginning to bloom. "You're carrying a lot," he said. "Someone has to," I replied. "Yes, but you don't have to carry it alone." He paused at the doorstep. "Crabapple Bend has a community of practitioners. We're supposed to work together. That includes sharing the burden of maintaining the binding and protecting the town's magical infrastructure." "I understand that intellectually," I said, "but Harrison almost destroyed everything, and I was the one who stopped him. That creates a weird dynamic where people might assume I'm uniquely capable." "People are going to assume a lot of things," Nolan said. "Your job is to let them know what's actually true. You're capable, yes, But you're not alone, and you're not responsible for everything that happens in this town. He was right, which I appreciated but also found slightly frustrating. I'd always preferred being responsible for things. It felt safer, more controlled. But Crabapple Bend wasn't something that could be controlled by one person. It was too large, too complex, too dependent on the network of practitioners and community members who all contributed to its stability. "Thank you," I said, "for the perspective." "Thank you," he replied, "for being stubborn enough to save this town even though you didn't have to." He left before I could respond, which was probably wise because my response would have been something inadequate like, "You're welcome," when what I actually meant was something much more complicated and personal. Quill was waiting inside, ready for dinner, ready for attention, ready for the evening routine that we'd established over the past months. I fed him, made tea, and sat in the fossek thinking about responsibility and community and what it meant to be part of something larger than myself. By morning, I'd made peace with my new understanding. I was part of a community. I wasn't the only person maintaining Crabapple Bend's magical infrastructure. I was one of many, and that was exactly as it should be. Shisan. Dark moment. The first hint that something was wrong came from Quill. He'd been sleeping peacefully, curled in his terrarium in the apartment, when he suddenly went rigid. His quills extended, his body stiffened, and he made a sound I'd never heard before. A kind of psychic wail that didn't use his mouth but resonated directly in my head. I was upstairs, working on inventory assessments, when I felt it. The vibration was immediate and overwhelming, panic and warning flooding through the connection between familiar and practitioner. "What's wrong?" I said aloud, going downstairs immediately. "Quill, what's happening?" He couldn't articulate it in words, couldn't give me specific information, but the feeling was clear. Something dangerous was happening. Something magical. Something directed at the town. Something that required immediate attention. I grabbed my phone and called Restrepo. "The binding," I said without preamble. "Something's wrong with the binding." "How do you know?" "Quill's sensing it. He's in distress. There's something, some kind of magical activity that doesn't feel right." There was silence while Restrepo processed this. "Come to my office. I'm calling the other practitioners." The drive to the sheriff's office took 5 minutes. Desmond was already there, his expression grim. Patricia arrived moments later, followed by Nolan, Sarah, James, and several others I'd come to know over the past months. "The binding is intact," Desmond said immediately, having apparently checked before Restrepo even finished the call. "But something is. It's being pushed, like someone's applying pressure at multiple points simultaneously." "Could it be residual damage from the winter ritual?" someone asked. "No," Patricia said. "This is fresh. Someone is actively working to find weak points." My stomach tightened. Harrison was in prison. He didn't have access to magic from his cell, but he had had years to establish plans, to create contingencies. He could have left instructions for allies on the outside. "We need to check the artifacts," I said. "All of them. Immediately. Someone might be trying to access them without triggering the protection spells." Over the next few hours, we discovered that 2 of the artifacts were showing signs of tampering. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was damaged beyond minor attempts at interference, but someone had definitely made an effort to access them. "This is reconnaissance," Nolan said. "Someone's testing the defenses, trying to understand how to get past them." "Who would do this?" Restrepo asked. "Harrison's in custody. His known associates have been identified and charged." "Someone new," I said, though I didn't want to acknowledge what that meant. Someone who learned about what Harrison was trying to do and decided to continue the work. The realization settled over the room like fog. Whatever we'd accomplished by catching Harrison, we hadn't actually addressed the fundamental problem. There were people in the world who wanted to destabilize Crabapple Bend's binding. There might be multiple people, in multiple locations, all working toward the same goal. We need to increase security around the artifacts, Patricia said. We need to do more than that, I said. We need to understand who's doing this. We need to trace the magical work and identify where it's coming from. But that was easier said than done. Magical traces are ephemeral. They don't leave fingerprints or DNA evidence. They disappear quickly, especially if the practitioner is meticulous about cleaning up after themselves. I spent the next week examining the artifacts that had been tampered with, trying to sense who had touched them, what their magical signature felt like. The impressions were faint and fragmented, but I got the sense of someone educated, deliberate, patient. Someone who understood binding magic at a theoretical level, but maybe lacked practical experience with it. This is someone learning, I told Restrepo. Someone who studied what Harrison was doing and is trying to replicate parts of his methodology. Can you identify them? Not yet. But if they keep trying to access the artifacts, I might be able to build a clearer picture. The attacks continued over the next 3 weeks. 3 more attempts to tamper with artifacts. Always subtle. Always quickly stopped by the protection spells. Each attempt gave me more information, more psychometric impressions, more sense of who I was dealing with. And none of it made sense. The magical signature was inconsistent. Sometimes it felt like one person. Sometimes it felt like multiple people working in coordination. The style was different each time, as if the practitioner was deliberately varying their approach to avoid being identified. This is someone very meticulous, Desmond said when I shared my observations. Someone who understands how practitioners work, how investigations function, how to obscure their identity. Or someone who's been trained by someone meticulous, I said. The possibility was horrifying. If Harrison had been part of a larger network, if his imprisonment hadn't actually disrupted whatever larger organization was trying to destabilize Crabapple Bend, then we might be facing opposition that was far more organized than I'd anticipated. One evening, after another day of failed attempts to trace the magical attacks, I sat in the fossek and felt something I'd been deliberately avoiding: despair. I'd come to Crabapple Bend to start over. I'd found purpose here, had become part of something meaningful. And now that meaningful thing was under threat from forces I couldn't quite identify, couldn't quite stop. Quill climbed onto my lap, his small body warm, his presence steady. He made a soft sound that suggested I was spiraling, that panic wasn't useful, that we needed rest and perspective before we could address this effectively. I can't protect the town, I said aloud. I'm one person. I'm still learning how this works. And whoever's trying to destabilize the binding is meticulous enough to stay hidden, coordinated enough to attack multiple artifacts simultaneously. Quill pressed his small head against my hand in a gesture that meant nothing specific and everything at once. Tomorrow, I told him. Tomorrow I'll be stronger. Tomorrow I'll figure out who's doing this. But tonight, I'm tired. I went to bed with the feeling that I'd been too optimistic, too quick to assume that catching Harrison meant the threat had been contained. In reality, I'd probably only ever stopped one part of a much larger problem. And I had no idea how to address the larger problem alone. 14. Connecting dots. I started from the beginning, going back through everything I knew about Harrison Webb, everything I understood about his methodology. He'd been meticulous about his financial operations, leaving trails that could eventually be followed but obscuring the original transactions. He'd been patient about building his network, recruiting allies slowly, testing their reliability before trusting them with critical information. What if the person attacking the artifacts now had learned from Harrison's mistakes? What if they were being even more precise about not leaving traces? I pulled out notebooks, began writing down facts and correlations. The attacks had occurred at specific times, always during magical transitions: sunrise, sunset, the moments when ley line energy was in flux. The targets were inconsistent geographically, but consistent in function. They were testing the binding's weaknesses, looking for specific pressure points. "Someone's mapping the binding," I said to Desmond, who'd come to the Fossick to help with the investigation. "They're not trying to break it yet. They're understanding how it works. They're learning where it's most vulnerable." "That takes time," Desmond said. "Years, probably. Whoever this is, they're thinking long-term." "Like Harrison did," I said. "Patient, methodical, strategic." But there was something else. Something about the attacks felt personal, felt like someone with a specific grievance rather than just ideology. Harrison had wanted power. This person seemed to be motivated by something else: anger, resentment, a need to prove something. I started pulling records. I examined everyone who had contact with Harrison, everyone who knew about his plans, everyone who might have been influenced by what he'd tried to do. And I found something. In Harrison's lawyer files, which were public record after the conviction, there was a reference to a sibling. Harrison had a brother named Michael who lived in Portland, who was apparently also a practitioner, who had been contacted by prosecutors during the investigation but had claimed ignorance about his brother's activities. "Why would Harrison's brother be contacting prosecutors?" I asked Restrepo. "Because the prosecution wanted to know if Michael had any information about larger networks or other people involved," Restrepo said. "Michael claimed he didn't, but he was also on the list of people who received money from Harrison." I pulled Michael's information. He was 5 years younger than Harrison, also worked in town administration, but in Portland instead of Crabapple Bend. His magical background was earth magic. He worked with municipal projects, understood infrastructure in a way that was useful, but probably not sufficient for binding magic. Unless he'd been trained. Unless Harrison had been teaching him. "I need to talk to Michael Webb," I told Restrepo. "I'll arrange it," she said. But Michael didn't come to Crabapple Bend. Instead, the attacks on the artifacts intensified. 4 artifacts showed signs of tampering on a single night, then 6. The attacks were becoming bolder, less meticulous about obscuring the magical work. The protection spells were holding, but the pressure was increasing. "He's accelerating," Nolan said at an emergency meeting of practitioners. "He's stopped being cautious because he's realized we've identified the pattern. He's going to try something definitive soon." "We should arrest him before he does," Restrepo said. "We have enough evidence of conspiracy and attempted magical sabotage." "We don't know for certain it's Michael," I said, though my gut was telling me it was. "We have circumstantial evidence and magical impressions. We need something concrete." "Then what do you suggest?" "I need to confront him," I said. "I need to see his reaction, feel his emotional response. Psychometry works best with direct contact and emotional intensity." "That's risky," Nolan said. "So is waiting for him to find a way to break through the protection spells," I countered. Restrepo arranged a meeting with Michael Webb in Portland. It was supposed to be a casual conversation, just a check-in about how he was doing after his brother's incarceration. I would be present as a town representative, someone following up on the attack patterns. Michael's apartment was in southeast Portland, overlooking a small park. He was in his early 40s, with his brother's sharp features but without Harrison's calm certainty. Michael looked nervous from the moment he opened the door. "I didn't know you were coming," he said to me. "The sheriff just said someone wanted to talk about my brother." "I wanted to understand your connection to what Harrison was doing," I said. "You received money from him. You know about binding magic. And someone's been attacking the binding artifacts in Crabapple Bend." Michael's face went pale. "That wasn't me." "But you know who it is." "No, He ran a hand through his hair. Harrison contacted me about a month after he was arrested. He was in prison. He shouldn't have been able to contact me, but he did. He told me that his plan was incomplete, that someone else had already been working on destabilizing the binding independently. He said that if I didn't want Crabapple Bend to be destroyed by magical chaos, I needed to help whoever was continuing his work. Who is it? I don't know. Harrison wouldn't tell me. He said the less I knew, the safer I was. He said the collector had already been caught. But there was someone else. Someone older. Someone more patient. My stomach tightened. Someone older? That's what he said. He made it sound like there was this ancient practitioner, someone who'd been working toward this for decades. I looked at Restrepo, who was standing by the door with an expression of controlled fury. We need to go back to Crabapple Bend, I said. We need to look at this differently. We're not looking for someone young and ambitious. We're looking for someone established, someone who's been part of the community for a long time, someone who has had years to plan. The drive back to town felt endless. My mind was working through possibilities, trying to identify who among Crabapple Bend's practitioners could have the knowledge, the resources, and the motivation to do this. And then I remembered something from Gretchen's ledger, an entry from years ago. Old practitioner asking unusual questions about binding artifacts, claims academic interest but appears to have practical experience. Pattern suggests long-term interest. Recommend observation. No name, just a description. Old, educated, patient. We need to look at Gretchen's notes again, I told Restrepo. She identified whoever this is years ago. She just never confirmed the identity. By the time we arrived at the Fossick, I'd narrowed it down to 3 possibilities. 3 practitioners who'd been in Crabapple Bend long enough to understand the binding deeply, who were old enough to have been working on this for years, who had the knowledge and resources necessary. I went through their files, examined every interaction they'd had with Gretchen, every mention in town records, and I found it. In the library records, completely innocuous, completely overlooked, there was a list of books checked out by someone named Eleanor, the archivist, the person who lived above the town archives, who'd interrupted my shift monitoring one of the binding artifacts, who I'd assumed was harmless. The books were all about binding magic, all about protective spells, all about techniques for destabilizing magical infrastructure. Eleanor, I said aloud. It's Eleanor Garrett. Restrepo had her in custody within the hour, and Eleanor, when confronted with the evidence, confessed everything. She'd been studying binding magic for 40 years, had been in Crabapple Bend for 30 of those years, had decided that the binding was limiting the town's potential. She'd been working with Harrison initially, had continued after his arrest, had been using magic with meticulous precision to avoid detection. Crabapple Bend could be so much more, she said, her voice calm and reasonable, if we removed the constraints of a protective spell designed 200 years ago. Crabapple Bend would descend into magical chaos, I said. The binding exists for a reason. The binding exists because people are afraid, Eleanor replied. I tried to teach them to be brave instead. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with magical monitoring to prevent her from practicing spells. The attacks on the artifacts stopped immediately. The bindings stabilized. And I returned to running the Fossick, understanding that this was probably not the last threat we'd face. Crabapple Bend's magical infrastructure was valuable precisely because it worked, because it protected people, because it allowed magic to exist in balance with human life. And there would always be people who wanted to disrupt that balance. 15. Reveal. Eleanor Garrett's arrest brought closure to the months of anxiety, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about security, about how much surveillance was appropriate in a magical community, about the balance between freedom and protection. The town council met to discuss these issues while Eleanor awaited trial. I attended because I was now officially the town's magical consultant, and my input was apparently necessary for understanding what had gone wrong and how to prevent similar situations in the future. "We need better intelligence gathering," Restrepo said. "We need to know about new practitioners coming to town, about unusual interest in binding artifacts, about any signs of magical research that could indicate suspicious intent." "That's surveillance," Patricia objected. "That's monitoring people's activities without their consent. That's precisely what creates the kind of paranoia that lets people like Eleanor convince themselves that their actions are justified." "But Eleanor had been working on this for 40 years, someone else said. "We should have caught her long before the attacks started." "How?" I asked. Eleanor was a librarian doing research. She was a practitioner studying binding magic. Both of those things are legitimate. The only way to identify her as a threat was to assume that interest plus knowledge equals intention to harm. That's not justice. That's paranoia. "But she did harm people," Restrepo said. "She orchestrated attempts to destabilize the binding. She recruited accomplices." After Harrison had already made it clear that destabilizing the binding was possible and that there was a path to success, I said. "She saw that someone had tried and failed, and she decided to continue the work." "That's on Harrison, partially. And it's on Eleanor. But it's not on everyone in town who's interested in binding magic." The meeting didn't resolve anything, but it created space for the conversation to happen. Over the following weeks, Crabapple Bend developed new protocols, notification systems for unusual magical activity, training for practitioners on recognizing signs of dangerous intent, regular reviews of who had access to binding artifacts. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than either complete surveillance or complete openness. And the town continued functioning, largely because most people understood that Crabapple Bend worked because of collective commitment to maintaining its magical infrastructure, not because of any single person's heroic efforts. Eleanor's trial took place in late June, about 8 months after Vernon's death. She was convicted and sentenced, and the courtroom emptied knowing that the threat had been addressed. Except that wasn't quite the end of it. A week after Eleanor's sentencing, Restrepo came to the Fossick with a question that had been bothering her. "Why Vernon?" she asked. "If Eleanor was working on this long term, why did Harrison kill Vernon now? Why not wait for the binding to degrade naturally?" "Because Vernon had information," I said, realizing the answer as I spoke it. "Vernon had some of the binding artifacts. He knew about maintenance protocols. He knew that the binding had started to fail naturally," Desmond said, arriving in the shop with his own set of realizations. Vernon understood that the spell was reaching the end of its 200-year lifespan. If the binding actually deteriorated on its own, the town would face chaos. But if practitioners knew it was failing, we could prepare, plan an earlier renewal, maintain control over the transition. "So Vernon was planning to tell someone?" Restrepo asked. "Vernon was planning to call an emergency meeting of the Binding Maintenance Council," I said, "to inform practitioners that the spell was failing and that we needed to begin preparations for an accelerated renewal." "And Harrison killed him to prevent that conversation from happening," Restrepo finished. "Yes, because if practitioners knew the binding was failing naturally, the destabilization plans would become irrelevant. The town would be prepared. But if the binding seemed stable, if people believed it had years left, then rapid deterioration could be positioned as unexpected catastrophe instead of natural process. That would give whoever was destabilizing it the element of surprise." We sat with this understanding for a long moment. Vernon had been killed not because of what he knew, but because of what he was going to say. His death was about silencing a warning. "Did Harrison ever communicate why he did this?" Restrepo asked. "Any indication in his statements or conversations?" "He claimed it was necessary," I said, remembering the interview transcripts I'd read. He claimed that Vernon's insistence on stabilizing the binding was preventing the town from reaching its potential. He claimed that destruction was the only way to force rebirth. He claimed a lot of things, Restrepo said bitterly, none of which actually justified killing someone. The revelation didn't change the legal outcomes. Harrison was still in prison. Eleanor was still in prison. The binding was stable and protected. But it changed how I understood Crabapple Bend's history. Vernon hadn't died because he was in the way of someone's ambition. He'd died because he was trying to protect the town, and that protection was incompatible with plans to destabilize it. He'd been a hero, though he'd died without ever being recognized as one. I made a point of visiting Restrepo and asking permission to document Vernon's role in the binding maintenance system, to make sure his contribution was recorded and remembered. She approved it, and I worked with Desmond to create an official commendation that would be placed in the town archives. Future practitioners should know what Vernon did, I said. They should know that protecting the binding sometimes costs people their lives. By the time summer arrived, Crabapple Bend had settled into a new normal. The binding was secure, the threats had been identified and imprisoned, the community had survived crisis and emerged stronger. I'd survived crisis too, and I'd emerged not just stronger, but also finally confident that I belonged in this town, in this role, in this life that I'd stumbled into through inheritance and accident. The fog still rolled in at 6:17 p.m. The crabapple tree still bloomed when significant events occurred. The binding still hummed beneath Crabapple Bend's streets, protecting the town from magical chaos, maintained by people who understood what it meant to protect something larger than themselves. And I was finally at peace with being one of those people. Shirlio. Restoration. By late summer, life in Crabapple Bend had achieved a rhythm that felt sustainable. I worked at the Fossick 4 days a week, consulted with the town on binding maintenance 1 day a week, and spent my remaining time reading, researching binding magic, strengthening my connection with Quill. The town council officially recognized my role as the town's magical consultant, complete with a modest salary and clear responsibilities. I was part of something genuine now, a community that valued my skills and trusted me with important work. One afternoon in August, Bea arrived at the Fossick with a basket. "The town wants to say thank you," she said, setting it on the counter. "For solving the murders, for protecting the binding, for becoming part of Crabapple Bend instead of just living here." Inside the basket were tea from Petrichor Coffee, a book about binding magic from Desmond, a container of specialty mealworms from Nolan for Quill, a handwritten note from Patricia that included translations of ancient magical texts I'd been struggling with, and a beautiful leather journal from Eleanor's library, before her arrest, that had apparently been meant as a gift to someone who appreciated meticulous documentation. There was also a letter from the town council, formally requesting that I consider accepting a position on the Binding Maintenance Oversight Committee. It was a volunteer position, but it meant having formal authority to make decisions about how the binding was protected and maintained. I called a meeting with Desmond, Patricia, Nolan, and Sarah to discuss the offer before accepting. "This is a significant commitment," Patricia warned. "The Oversight Committee makes major decisions about magical resource allocation, about who has access to binding artifacts, about how the town's magical infrastructure is protected. You'd be responsible for recommendations that affect everyone." "I understand," I said. "But I think I'm ready. I've learned a lot over the past year. I understand how the binding works. I understand the town's magical community, and I understand what it costs to protect something this important." "Then accept," Nolan said. "Crabapple Bend needs people who take this seriously." I wrote my formal acceptance that evening, knowing that this decision would shape the next years of my life. I was committing to Crabapple Bend, to its magical infrastructure, to the responsibility of maintaining protection for a town built on a powerful ley line, it was the right decision. The crabapple tree bloomed that evening, silver flowers falling like snow, acknowledging the significance of my commitment. Over the following weeks, I worked with Patricia and Desmond to understand the full scope of binding maintenance. There were 12 other artifacts distributed around town, each one requiring regular attention, each one vulnerable to the kind of sabotage Eleanor and Harrison had attempted. We developed new protocols, quarterly inspections of each artifact, annual maintenance rituals, a network of practitioners trained to recognize signs of tampering. We created redundancies in the protection spells, making it harder for someone to destabilize the binding without multiple simultaneous attacks at multiple locations. This is what Gretchen was doing for 30 years, Patricia said, reviewing our new maintenance schedule. This constant vigilance, this endless work. Most people don't understand how much goes into maintaining a binding this old and this powerful. They understand now, I said, thinking of Vernon, of Eleanor, of Harrison. They understand because people have died protecting it. That's a powerful motivation. In September, the binding had been in place for exactly 201 years. The town held a celebration recognizing the 2-century milestone. People gathered in Crabapple Square, standing around the massive crabapple tree, acknowledging the work of everyone who'd maintained the spell over the decades. Gretchen's memory was honored. Vernon was formally recognized for his service and his sacrifice. The practitioners who'd coordinated the renewal ritual in winter were thanked for their work. And I was introduced as the newest member of the Binding Maintenance Oversight Committee, someone who'd become part of Crabapple Bend's magical infrastructure through inheritance and accident and choice. "Welcome," the mayor said, extending her hand. "We're glad you're here." After the celebration, Nolan asked if I wanted to walk to the harbor. The evening was mild, the ocean was calm, and Barnacle was apparently interested in meeting with his favorite hedgehog. "How are you feeling?" he asked as we walked. "Settled," I said. "Peaceful. Like I've finally figured out who I'm supposed to be." "Most people take longer than a year to reach that understanding," Nolan said. "Most people don't inherit magic shops and solve murders," I countered. "True," he agreed. "You've had a peculiar year." At the harbor's edge, we stood watching the water while Quill and Barnacle engaged in the kind of interaction that only happened between familiars, a complex communication of feeling and intention that humans couldn't quite interpret. But I could sense the affection between them, the recognition of a shared purpose. "Quill likes you," I said. "Quill tolerates me," Nolan corrected. Which, for a hedgehog with strong opinions about everything, is approximately the same as affection. We stood together in the evening quiet, and for the first time since arriving in Crabapple Bend, I felt no need to fill the silence with conversation. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing, surrounded by people who understood what it meant to work together towards something larger than individual ambition. The binding was secure, the threats had been addressed, the town was safe, and I was home. When I returned to the Fossick that evening, I found that someone had left a gift on the doorstep, a new crystal, slightly smaller than Patricia's artifact, with a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. "For when you need grounding, a friend." I held the crystal and felt only peace in its psychometric signature. No violence, no resentment, just intention toward protection and stability. I brought it upstairs to the apartment, where Quill was settling into his evening routine. He examined the crystal, approved of it with a small sound, and curled up to sleep. I sat in the window seat, watching the fog roll in at its usual time, and I thought about the year behind me and the years ahead. I thought about Vernon, who'd died trying to warn the town. I thought about Eleanor and Harrison, who'd chosen destruction over acceptance. I thought about Gretchen, who'd understood that some things are worth protecting, even when protection costs everything. And I thought about myself, a forensic accountant who'd come to a magical town to start over and had discovered that starting over meant becoming part of something ancient and powerful and worth every ounce of commitment. Tomorrow, I'd return to work at the Fossick. Tomorrow, I'd continue learning binding magic. Tomorrow, I'd be part of Crabapple Bend's endless work to maintain the spell that protected it. But tonight, I let myself rest. The silver flowers from the crabapple tree swirled in the fog, beautiful and strange and exactly right. Quill made a small sound that suggested contentment, and I closed my eyes, feeling held by the town that had taken me in, grateful for the inheritance that had brought me here, confident in the future we were building together. This was home. Finally, genuinely, completely home.
Thank you for listening. Please visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review.